Last. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to the New Center for live streaming this. This is the opening of the final day of Fernando Zalamea's seminar, Grothendieck and a Theory of Contemporary Transgression. My name is Christopher Vitale. I'm Associate Professor of Media Studies in the Graduate Program in Media Studies at Pratt Institute, and I'm going to be giving an introductory talk today before the roundtable, and the topic of this talk is Why Zalamea Matters, Philosophy, Semiosis, Politics, and Culture. Okay, Quinn, can you, sorry, I will have to tell Quinn when to advance the slides here. So, it is my belief that today the primary function of mathematics in society is to maintain the established order, the status quo, to produce and maintain social hierarchy and disempowerment and inequality for the masses. I can say this for two reasons. The first of which is that I spent about 15 years working as a mathematics tutor for high school age students. That was during graduate school, undergraduate, high school. That was my primary means of income. I also then tutored mathematics for the SATs, the GREs, the exams that people have to take to get into even humanities programs. In things like English, if you want to do a PhD in English, you have to take the GREs. And you have to know a certain amount of mathematics for this. And one thing I noticed was that most of the mathematics that was being taught would never, ever, ever be used by the people who were taking this. The primary reason that people were failing out of high school, college, and were unable to get into graduate school, perhaps not as much the latter, but certainly the primary reason why people were failing out of high school and college was the inability to complete courses in mathematics, and for things that would have absolutely no relevance to their future career education. Most of the most complex mathematics that everyone I knew would use later in life was how much of a discount they would get at the store on certain things, 20%, 30%, that sort of work. And it is not my belief that this is because mathematics is inherently evil or anything like that. However, the way mathematics was taught was completely divorced from context. It was completely an abstract series of puzzles and riddles which seemed to have absolutely no real-world relevance. And it was intentionally taught this way. And if you look at the reasons why mathematics is generally argued to be taught in this manner, is that it increases the ability to serve the development of logical reasoning skills, and that it helps people to form the ability to solve problems that require multiple answers, sometimes indeterminate types of answers, and hence is supposed to develop skills in logical reasoning. That said, most of the logical reasoning and difficult types of problem solving that you encounter in the real world could be much more easily simulated by actually producing some of those situations and having people solve group problems. And so as someone who has worked in mathematics education, my primary experience as someone who is looking towards a more liberated and less oppressive world, and someone who is an educator, is to see mathematics as a gatekeeper. It's a way in which society produces a perpetual disempowered underclass, which then has no option but to work in food service and McDonald's and things of the sort, so that the people who can master highly abstract mathematics, usually through the help of tutors, go on to Harvard, and then, as I think now 40% of Harvard undergraduates now become investment bankers. And those are people who use mathematics largely to make sure that the rest of the world can't figure out what's being done with capital. And money is shifted with all sorts of algorithms all over the place, according to computer technologies, which are run by people who read all sorts of computer languages that, again, very few people are able to master. And we have a world in which most of what controls things is kept completely obfuscated by what Alain Badiou famously calls the despotism of number. Now, I've added technology here, and I'm very hesitant to even make a reference to Heidegger, seeing how despicable his politics is. However, Heidegger does, I think, have a point in that the reduction of the world to technology, and really the emplacement of everything as standing reserve for technological development is a radical impoverishment of the world. And this is an area where I think mathematics has become radically impoverished as a discipline because it has become at the service of industry, at the market, of technology, of finance, and the military-industrial complex that needs a mass of unskilled workers that can be kept out of the systems of power, and have a small elite that is able to manage these numbers in ways that are completely disconnected from real-world effects. So the way in which number, and not just number, but mathematics in general, has been deployed has been to, I believe, strip the true radicality and potential of mathematics from the way it is employed in society, in the way in which language likewise suffers an impoverishment when its only purpose in society is technology, the market, calculation, and the military-industrial complex. In this sense, mathematics is served up reified, completely disconnected from context, atomized, disconnected from its history, from the philosophers of mathematics. Education in most forms are reduced to a form of STEM, which in our society has been called science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Notice how mathematics is the last of these, right? It is the hand person to technology in this sense. And this is the way in which mathematics is, I believe, stripped of its potential to actually be a revolutionary and massively creative discourse. Next slide, Quinn. Okay, I believe this is due to a series of ideologies of what math and science can be. The 20th century foundations crises that happened in mathematics, science, and wider culture, represented by the names Gödel in terms of mathematics, obviously in his attempt to solve the aporias that arose in set theory through Cantor in the early 20th century, Hilbert's project to try to establish the foundations of mathematics, Gödel's famous set of proofs that showed the difficulties of trying to do anything of the sort, the rise of quantum physics in the realm of physics, but also relativity theory, and then in the wider culture, the deconstruction of all certainties and the rise of postmodernism in a huge variety of zones of culture. And this is not to even mention the rise of reflexivity and modernism in art, that it is as if every zone of contemporary culture in the 20th century hit a foundations crisis at one point or another. And the way in which mathematics and science is often practiced outside of a few zones that deal with its borders, its transits, and its areas of foundation. The areas of so-called normal science, as Thomas Kuhn would describe this, these areas seem to operate under a productive, yet ultimately disturbing set of disavowals, right? And disavowal, according to psychoanalysis, takes the formula of, I know X is the case, but nevertheless, right? Everyone knows Gödel, but nevertheless. Everyone knows Heisenberg and uncertainty and Eisenstein and relativity, but nevertheless, normal science and normal mathematics will continue. And this is something that Fernando talks about in his Synthetic Philosophy of Contemporary Mathematics when he says, just open the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Mathematics. And what you find is that it is dominated by Platonists who believe that the numbers are real. There are a handful of people who believe it's a game, a semiotic game of sorts, but primarily it's Platonists, and it's primarily people who still adhere to logicism and set theory, who are widely disconnected from the practice of what Fernando has referred to, quoting some other philosophers of mathematics, as real mathematics, the mathematics that is done at the forefront of mathematical research, where there is a wide bestiary of mathematical objects which are completely not seen by the abstract elementarization of mathematics when viewed from the basis of set theory, which takes a fully analytic view of mathematics, which reduces the bestiary only to what must be true, and which takes the law of the excluded middle as the foundations of sensibility, reasonability, and ultimately what is mathematically interesting and useful. So the disavowal of the paradoxes that arose in the foundations crises are precisely what allows normal mathematics and normal science, in the Kuhnian sense, to proceed as it is. And the reason for this is that analytic approaches, logicist approaches, and concrete approaches, reductionist approaches in the sciences, are the forms of science and mathematics that are amenable to a complete reduction of mathematics and science to techne. They reduce the power of mathematics and science to disturb ways of knowing, to open up new creativity. that can show us new lenses on the cosmos. New lenses not only on the cosmos in the broadest sense, but the very everyday life world right in front of us. And one thing I think that Fernando does is he shows us the way in which mathematical objects can emerge from within the fabric of the world that we see all around us in ways that we will not have access to if we only look at the abstract. We have to bring the concrete through the synthetic back into mathematics. And this is something which has to happen in the sciences too, and this is why I draw a lot in my work from complex system science. And the reason for some of this is that I believe at the limits of the contemporary disciplines, at the foundations of most of these disciplines, are zones that ask difficult philosophical questions that disturb the ability to reify these disciplines as such. They ask questions such as, what is number? What is space? What is time? What is matter? Energy, meaning, value. These are questions that disturb the ability to reify a discipline. And to reify a discipline is to make it amenable to a status quo that has been institutionalized in a particular way and that is invested in what Gayatri Spivak calls the reproduction of cognitive authority. And I think what Fernando's doing in part is to help to disrupt this. Okay, next slide, please. What Fernando is doing is he's helping us to build a post-foundation for mathematics, for the contemporary age. This sort of post-foundational work first emerges in mathematics with the development of category theory in the wake of the debacles of set theory. Category theory bases itself on morphisms and transformations as opposed to logics of inclusion and what Badiou would say, logics of being. Right, for Badiou, and I think this is an important intervention, set theory is fundamentally ontology, and it is related to a worldview which can best be described philosophically as that of being. Whereas category theory for Badiou is related to issues of representation, and particularly representation in terms of becoming. What I find a bit problematic for Alain Badiou is that he believes in strict binaries. Right, he believes very much in a sort of Maoist production of you're with us or you're against us, and he splits off set theory and category theory while ignoring the bestiary, ignoring the concrete mathematics which is being produced that Fernando looks at as the foundation of his post-foundational project. He wants to look at math as it's created in situation rather than the abstract universal. He wants a concrete universal, to use a Hegelian term. And this is why he believes that even category theory is far too abstract. Sheaf theory can actually provide a new post-foundation that shows us the way in which the universal is only truly liberated into its potential in concrete form, in its contact with actual obstacles and in the production of transits in the world in front of us. And this is something that is deeply Peircian. This is something that is not only true of mathematics, I believe, but that is true of the sign in the most general sense. And this is something when Fernando talks in his Peirce book about the way in which the real line, continuity, is the sign, is generality, is universality. He's linking up what are usually thought of as radically disjunct areas of study. The study of signs in the Peircian sense, which can extend not only to language, but to mathematics and the concrete world itself. For Peirce, all of these are signs. Universality is as much a part of the world as it is a part of language, as it is a part of form and number. These are aspects of universality. And there's no need for a firm division between the stuff of the world and the abstract sign, because all we ever encounter in our world is mixtures. And the production of polarities then is our way of trying to work with these in the production of transits, meaningful objects, and dealing with obstructions to create new possibilities. But the bifurcation of the world into these sorts of divisions is for Peirce only something that we produce to help us navigate. It's not something that is necessarily an aspect of the world as such. And so when we bifurcate the world into matter and mind, matter and meaning, for Peirce, these are only ever tentative bifurcations that are pragmatically useful in particular applications. And this is why Fernando is a thinker that I like to think of as fundamentally impure, fundamentally dirty, fundamentally in between. He's a theorist of media, of in-betweenness. He believes we are always in media res, we are always caught in the middle, and it is from the middle that we work to navigate by creating poles of ideality and materiality. But those are only ever there to help us navigate in the production of transits. And transits are ways in which we can be useful in regard to particular problems in situation. His deeper project, as far as I can tell from when I read him as much as I can, is a renewed Peircianism, looking at mathematics as part of a general pragmatic semiosis of culture that produces sheaves which range from the mathematical to the artistic to the musical to the social and back and forth. For Fernando Zalamea, these are all potential material for sheafification. And it is the admixture of what are generally thought of as distinct zones in our culture that are particularly rife for the production of new forms of generality that can have an impact beyond the ways in which mathematics has been cut up and zoned in particular disciplinary locales in places like universities, in ways in which, say, philosophy has likewise been completely disrupted from a living relationship to wider culture. Mathematics, philosophy, all of these reified disciplines need to come back into relation to each other and the wider culture as a whole because of the potential to produce new forms of sheafification. Okay. Zalamea's social vision. If you look at the reasons that Fernando gives for some of the moves he makes, he speaks of the extremes in our culture between extreme relativism of postmodernism and the desire for neo-absolutisms that we see in our society. And he believes that we need to make a shift from either of these options, a sort of Scylla and Charybdis of contemporary modernity, to what he refers to as transmodernity. Now, what he refers to as the postmodern, I think, is most in line with a certain moment in postmodernity, the radical deconstruction of all certainties that you see in the immediately post-war period. And this is why, for Fernando, we as a culture are beyond this, but sometimes our thinking is not. We need to realize that we are in a transmodern moment in which going back to the old certainties is not a solution, but the extreme relativism and skepticism which go with this are also not a solution. And so for Fernando, the goal here is the production of relative universals to orient ourselves in a world where everything is a mixture, everything is a particular, but the forms of particularity that manifest before us can always be reworked, can always be reframed in regard to universals, which frame a particular as a new form of singularity in relationship to others. And so for Fernando, there's something almost Spinozist about this, I believe, if I'm doing him justice, that we don't know yet what a body can do. When encountered by an object, mathematical or otherwise, we cannot deal with it as an immediacy. It is always a mixture, and hence there's a need to blast it out from its immediacy, to understand it in regard to new universals that may not immediately be apparent. This is actually quite similar to Hegel's famous moment in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the chapter on sense certainty, when Hegel actually attempts to talk about, well, nothing could be more concrete to us, nothing more immediate to our senses than if we're standing next to a tree. But Hegel says, well, if you're standing next to a tree, as soon as you call it a tree, you are immediately then saying, well, this is similar in some way to all the other trees that is out there. And you are negating the very tree in front of you because you're saying, well, it's similar to a maple, similar to an oak, and in that sense, it is dissimilar to itself. By being a tree, it has its own negation in front of it. And the thing that's in common to all the trees I've ever experienced is myself, which is the actual constitutive negation that allows the tree to presence itself in the mode of seeming immediacy. For Hegel, nothing is immediate. And this is something that I see in Fernando Zalamea's work as well, that the illusion of immediacy conceals the fact that we are always dealing with universals. That as soon as I say, this is a table, this is the floor, this is a chair or a tree or whatever, we are employing universals, and any sense of concrete immediacy, of the obviousness of what we are dealing with, obscures the fact that there is metaphysics, there is universality in the seemingly most singular entities. And pulling out how those are often latent there, and imagining new forms of universality that can produce new forms of smoothness that open up transits that may have been obscured otherwise, I believe is a radical potential inside of his work. So Zalamea's social vision is to provide a post-foundational cognitive mapping, what Deleuze would refer to as a form of transcendental empiricism. And note that for Deleuze, it's not transcendent empiricism, right? The transcendent is recourse to an absolute. For Zalamea, we do not have access to absolutes, and as soon as we try, we end up getting all sorts of feedback effects. Like when you put a microphone next to a speaker, we get that horrible screeching noise, and this is something that I believe Gödel and Heisenberg, but also the deconstructionists in the 20th century evidenced to some extent, that when you try to use the universal to found the universal, or do the obverse, which is equally a form of idealism, use the material to imagine the foundations of the material, you end up getting limit effects. You end up getting paradoxes. And so this is why I believe for him, the attempt is to develop what Deleuze would speak of a transcendental empiricism. Look for the universalities within the local to help to navigate without going for absolute foundations, because it is the attempt to produce absolute foundations that actually produces these sorts of feedback effects, which are endemic perhaps to the structure of universalities themselves. Okay, this leads to the fact that for Fernando, the use of the excluded middle is in particular a limited case. It is something that has its uses, but it is not the broadest notion of what sense can be. Universality can and must be non-separated, what Deleuze would refer to as a disjunctive synthesis. It must be able to incorporate negation into its structure. Because if we cannot think of logics beyond the binary, beyond yes and no, true and false, so much of the world is going to be outside of thought. And this is something that speaks to my own work, where I'm inspired by soft computation, which very often uses non-binary truth values, and can be captured to some extent by fuzzy and multi-valued logics, but also often the forms of neurocomputation and evolutionary computation that are developed simply do not play by the games of the excluded middle. It's just not how they function. And so in this sense, the excluded middle is the exception rather than the rule in many forms of universality in the world. And I think the excluded middle needs to be seen as a particular case. Okay, and so I think we've got a general sense of what he's trying to do here to produce relative universals that help us to navigate new transits and fundamentally broaden our sense of what universality can mean, to give rise to a pragmatic oscillation between analysis or top-down differential thinking and synthetic or bottom-up integrative thinking. Okay, next. Okay, and this ties into, I believe, a fundamental critique of immediacy. And this is something that he gets from Lautmann and Peirce, but there's a degree to which both of these, and I think specifically Peirce, describes his indebtedness to Hegel. He also talks about Schelling at points, but German idealism is a key reference point for Peirce. Lautmann, however, I believe is also essential for what Fernando's doing. There is a fundamental anti-essentialism that Fernando speaks about in Synthetic Philosophy of Contemporary Mathematics, and this can be linked up to a wide variety of positions in contemporary philosophy and critical theory. From Bergson, who says that everything is mixed measure in a way that was a strong influence on Deleuze, who refers to everything we encounter as a multiplicity of a sort of Spinoza-style self-differing substance, the Spinozist notion that we do not know what a body can do. Hegel refers to this as the concrete universal as opposed to the abstract universal. Whitehead refers to what he calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which happens when we reify things from process. I believe that all of these notions are tied into and fellow travelers in a certain sense to what Fernando is doing and the site of potential future sheafifications of Fernando's project in relationship to mathematics. So he has a critique of immediacy in all of its forms, but there's also an inverse critique. Because for Fernando, extreme idealism and extreme materialism are both forms of immediacy of the ideal, if in photonegative. So when you completely reify the ideal and completely reify the material, you are actually still within the abstract universal. And this is something that Hegel would argue, that when you're dealing with the immediate or the extremely abstract or the extremely material, your universal is still abstract and not concrete, which is to say, it is not truly a synthesis of the singular and the universal in a particular. And it's only through the intertwining of these that you get the full richness of what either the material or the universal can produce. And so I do believe that we have a thinking of what Hegel would call the concrete universal. And I think this is not disjunct from what Peirce would call the larger scale hope that he had, that our universe would evolve towards something broader and more shot through with the universal, but not an abstract universal, but rather a universal which is able to account for the world and all of its diversity, something which he referred to in a very strange, almost hippie-like sounding phrase, although he was way before the hippies, his dream of evolutionary love. Now, this is the same guy who was one of the founders of mathematical logic. He believed in evolutionary love, and for him it was not all hugs and wonderfulness. It was actually a rigorous philosophical hope for the future, not only of humanity, but the future of the cosmos, that the universal would get broader and more non-separate, and that the universal was not something that merely happened in our heads, but was concretely instantiated in the very stuff of the world. For Peirce, matter is simply mind that has gotten dormant. It is mind that has taken on habits, and it has to be liberated from those habits by the potential within the universal. And as the universal gets broader, as it's able to account for things such as the excluded middle, but not only that, as it's able to think new forms of contrariety along with contradiction in regard to what these things have in common, then we're able to see things like, say, the Riemann-Roch hypothesis that Fernando was talking about in his lectures, the way in which the seemingly discrete and continuous can be brought together as aspects of a broader conception of universality, where magnitude and number, and also things that seem to be obstructions along with transits, can be linked together in a synthesis which is more than the sum of the parts. Okay, next. I believe that what Fernando Zalamea has been doing, I keep saying Fernando because I know him as a person, now he's sitting right here, but what Zalamea has been doing in this lecture series is actually performing what he's been describing. So and this is to take a terminology from Austin's theory of performative speech acts, but on the constitutive level, we've got what Fernando has been arguing we should be doing. But in many senses, Fernando has been doing exactly what he's been preaching to us. He has shown us through his actions what a sheafification project looks like. He performs a Warburgian mixture, which links together widely diverse areas of cultural analysis, from the extremely abstract logics of higher mathematics to the histories of art, to the productions of music, to everything from visual culture to architecture, the Atlas of Transformation. And notice that in each of his lectures, he has different levels, and he's looking for the possible transits between these. He's looking for the possible ways in which they can be linked together, that new sheaves can be formed, and in the process, new transits and mappings open up that can link our collective pasts to our potential futures. He transgresses the divisions and reifications to find new forms of smoothness. Okay, next. And what does this mean for the future? Well, first off, I have already mentioned Peirce's notion of evolutionary love. I believe that Fernando's work is a form of neo-suprarationalism. That is, he believes that there's a need for a return to a rationalism, but it has to be an expanded notion of rationalism. This is not the form of rationalism that we saw in, say, Hilbert's project or in reductionist versions of science. It is the type that has to be able to play well with things like quantum physics and the ways in which quantum logics do not follow the rule of the excluded middle. It's a form of rationalism which is able to speak to the contradictions in our contemporary culture. And it's fundamentally one which is non-separated, which is able to look at disjunction as a form of connection and look at that as productive for new types of thinking. And in this, I see a commonality with the work of dialecticians such as Hegel and Marx. I do see something in common with Ernesto Laclau's work on empty signifiers, and here I see the potential for a political set of interventions of a Zalamean thrust. Ernesto Laclau speaks of the way in which certain signifiers in our culture, such as truth or justice or freedom, become increasingly emptied of significance as they become fundamental to certain discourses which are nodular in our society. And the political contest for meaning of these fundamental signifiers becomes fraught with all sorts of imaginary projections, which for Laclau enables the potential for new formations of meaning to emerge as empty signifiers or relatively empty signifiers such as truth and justice become contested in society. They become, as they empty out, the site for more and more groups to actually link up their dreams and visions to those signifiers. And I think this can be linked up to the discourse of smoothness, which Fernando talks about, and particularly how sheaves allow for the formation of new transits in society. Now, this is something that Fernando has not spoken about. This is an area where I am thinking how Fernando's work can be sheafified in new and different ways. And I think when he talks about the project for creation and discovery of new mathematical potentials, that it ties into or can tie into the potential for the production of new social formations. And I think a lot of his work, which attempts to speak to social formations and to try to skirt around the twin pitfalls of extreme relativism and extreme neo-absolutism, are an attempt to imagine ways in which a new supra-rationalism can actually help culture as a whole and not merely the discourse of mathematics. What I do worry about sometimes is that there needs to be a way in which mathematics and even a neo-supra-rationalism thinks the conditions of production, the constitutive exclusions whereby contemporary institutions such as mathematical education, the discourse of mathematics in the university, and the discourse of philosophy in the university fundamentally are premised on certain exclusions. And this is where I think anyone who works in philosophy and mathematics today, and I can include myself as someone who works in philosophy, needs to think about the ways in which the continuing production of abstract philosophy, abstract mathematics, abstract discourses of all sorts are tied into questions of social violence and oppression. And I think unless our universals are wide enough to think about these issues and work to integrate them into our new sheaves, then they're only going to take in so much of the world. And this is where I think that Peirce's notion of universals which are wide enough to think forms of contradiction can be used to think about social contradiction as well. And this is where the Hegelian and Marxist side comes in. For Marx, the universal has to be wide enough, non-separated from oppression, and the way in which oppression is so much a part of our institutions, including the institutions of mathematics, philosophy, the academy, etc., that I think there's a Marxist side here that can be seen in the way in which, now of course, I don't know if Fernando would go with all of this, and we'll see what he thinks in a moment, but there is a Benjaminian side to his work, a deeply Benjaminian side, where he believes that, as Benjamin does when Benjamin speaks in his what's the name of the work in German? The Trauerspiel book, right? The one on the German mourning play, right? With the epistemo-critical prologue, he talks about the ruins and the constellation of ruins that can be brought together. And from that, the emergence of hope comes about, right? You take the ruins, the fragments and the shards of a culture that has been shattered. And through the compositions of these ruins, in an almost Warburgian sense, you can see a new constellation of forces emerge. Through this, hope emerges again for Benjamin. And this is where he sees the shards of the messianic and the revolutionary lurking within the shattered fragments of the society he was writing in a way that I think speaks to our present age. I think what Fernando is doing in mathematics and in the wider culture is a project that is very similar to Benjamin's. I think it is wide enough to become a truly revolutionary practice that speaks to social violence and oppression, particularly when linked up with the Marxist problematic. Certainly this is my dream and hope, is to bring out the Benjaminian Marxist side of the true radicality of what I think Fernando is doing, which is showing that it is not necessary to divide the world into mind and matter, subject and object. Rather, it is possible to look at the world as fundamentally mixed, and through the arrangement of the shards that we find in front of us, to open up new transit points, to point to visions of hope that can emerge from within the fabric of the stuff in front of us, which has infinite potential to produce the new, not in spite of the obstacles, but because of its relationship to the obstacles in front of it. That there is an infinite potentiality within the stuff of the world in relationship to the objects which are the obstacles, which are the conditions of the possibility of creation. And so I do think that what we're seeing is a radical vision, not only for mathematics, but for wider culture, with radical potential implications for thinking oppression in our world today, in and beyond the way in which mathematics has become often an atomized discourse of the powerful. I think mathematics can and must be so much more, and I think Fernando's work provides a counter-post foundation that can help those of us who are not mathematicians to show that math does not have to be normal mathematics in the Kuhnian sense, nor does it have to be the paradoxes and impasses of set theory, that post foundations are possible that can speak to the concrete issues of our everyday world. So hopefully I have done some justice to Fernando's project, as I have warped it to some extent to my own concerns. But with this, I'd like to open it up for questions and to Fernando. So thank you, everyone. So Fernando, please.
I was kind of already pissed that I was not going to comment. I have talked a lot around this week. I am extremely overwhelmed by your wonderful presentation. The capacity of synthesis well beyond my capacities, and so I'm extremely grateful. I would like to have a few questions for the group.
Yes, please.
I love that you opened it speaking about the pedagogy. And I think something I'm really interested in is, does a 21st century synthetic philosophy of mathematics help you understand the relationship between, like, you know, Calculus 101 and the institution and the world? Or is it 21st century synthetic philosophy of mathematics that affects Calculus 101?
Well, I think both, certainly.
Yeah.
I think if a Zalamean vision were to influence the way mathematics is taught, it would probably be taught from the most basic levels in a radically different way. Probably something much closer to what John Dewey talks about in his educational models, where education grows from the exigencies of the life world, and in which mathematics is not atomized and reified from other disciplines, where its history and philosophical issues are part of the way it is taught, and in which mathematics is seen as one other form of framing problems that need to be solved in relationship to the world. And so I think Fernando's vision is mathematics is fundamentally a creative, productive enterprise. And I think the way we teach math as mere techne really just makes it an abstract game, and those who are able to get tutors to get further with the game get diplomas and things. But that's not what math is, and certainly from what Fernando has described with Grothendieck, that's not what math was for him. It was a really fascinating game of creation, and it was like all games, it has limits, right? It has obstructions, it has rules, but the interesting thing about mathematics is that you can, in relationship to certain obstacles, shift the rules underneath your feet. And this is how language works. This is how life works, right? So there are ways in which the sign is not unrelated to life. You have to play with the rules to learn how to work the rules in certain ways. And so I think his vision could have an impact on mathematics education at the most basic levels. I also think it could impact the way in which I think this is where his book really does make an intervention, is the most abstract levels of philosophy and history of mathematics. And this is where I think if we start looking for post foundations for mathematics, Fernando's work supplies that. And there's something that I think is so empowering for those of us who are not mathematicians to be like, There's somebody who knows their stuff really, really, really well and says that it doesn't have to be logicism and set theory. And it's, you know, the difficulty of Fernando's work is nevertheless something that I think has allowed it to speak to a very wide audience in a certain sense, because so many of us, I think, became interested in a deep level in this sort of mathematics, particularly through the way in which Fernando linked it to other discourses. And so there is a way into these discourses because there's something about Fernando's work that, despite its difficulty, is accessible. Yeah.
Very specific question. Do you happen to know if the Common Core or the way the Museum of Mathematics is approaching its program is closer to what you want or farther from it?
I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question.
Math art. They do a lot of math art and physics, those kind of
Yeah.
conferences, right? And it seems to me it's much closer.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, if you look at the history of mathematics, so much of the developments were brought about through engineering questions, right? I mean, Leibniz was working on, yeah, Euler, right? They were doing practical problems and they had to invent the math to do what they wanted to do. And even someone like Grothendieck, as Zalamea has shown us, he was trying to solve some particular problems and he had to invent the math to do it. And I think if we think of mathematics education in terms of problem solving and in terms of artistic creation, that it really shows the potential of a field that has been reduced to mere techne, and alienating techne at that, that serves, I believe, capitalist reproduction. Yeah.
One book that you didn't mention, but it's probably right, which is now available in translation, which I particularly like to recommend to the audience, is the one on continuity.
Oh yeah, that's an incredible book.
Yeah, which is available, can be bought on the internet. And I think that one of Professor Zalamea's achievements stand in my estimation, that deserve particular mention, is the prominence that he gives to first as a thinker that can help transcend the points that we talk about, particularly from the point of view of the history of ideas. There's a very long pedigree that attaches to the distinction between abstract and concrete. It goes back at least to the Catholic Church, and then, strangely enough, to Freudian. And what links those two, and which pervades, I think, our way of regarding mind-body problems and all the things, is the dismissal of the surface. That we must look beyond the surface in order to reach truth. And so the Catholic Church has a whole series of concepts which capitalism and pervades as being truth, and the things that you see should be one should be wary of them because they lead away from truth. Same thing with psychoanalysis. The human behavior is it's mendacious. What you see on the surface has its explanation in something like these categories of Freud created, or sometimes embedded in our psyche. And I think that with Professor Zalamea's championing of first, we're moving away in the 21st century from those attitudes which have plagued disciplines like linguistics. Linguistics is a prime example of the failure of that attitude which says the surface doesn't count, and the reality is that somehow there is something mysterious underneath. So my prediction as a linguist is that Chomsky will be a footnote in the history of linguistics. By the end of the 21st century, it'll just be a long footnote.
That would be nice. I mean, I think his politics is fantastic, but his linguistics is reactionary. And what's interesting to me is that for him, those need to be kept separate. And this is where Peirce is, I think, so much more interesting. Yeah.
The extent to which Chomsky is mendacious, when he was asked who his favorite philosopher was,
Ooh. That's wow. Yeah. I mean, if you want a non-binary or post-binary approach to linguistics, you have to go through Peirce. But I mean, the division between signifier and signified is Saussure's legacy, and you know, I think Chomsky is the cybernetic inheritance of that. So, yeah, I mean, this is why Peirce is so useful for film studies, which is an area where I do a lot of my primary teaching in. Peirce is not someone who believes that you need a firm distinction between the linguistic sign and the world, and this is why there's all these gradations of signs. And that's incredibly useful for film theory, because for Peirce, the world is fundamentally full of meaning. And it's not, you know, the sign versus brute matter. Meaning is everything. Everything is a sign for Peirce. Everything. And it's truly radical, I think.
I think it's somewhat that meaning is not enough here in meaning. This is a very profound idea, which then gives you a kind of guidebook how to do those things that pertain to what human beings are and do. But we are thrust into semiosis, I think it says something. We are in semiosis. It says that the world, universe is perfused, perfused by semiosis. And so maybe he didn't say exactly that way. I think that's a very profound idea. It's not in us. It's not in our brain. It's our brain and our body is thrust into meaning. You can't escape it. I mean, unless we're kind of pathological. And this idea should be a guide. I mean, as rudimentary as it is, to how you do your discipline. You know, the disciplines have I think you mentioned that, right, in connection with postmodernism. Postmodernism is a rejection of the idea of disciplinarity, because post and multi and whatever disciplinarity you talk about, what has happened is that the disciplines have fallen apart. Look at linguistics. The departments have been closed down all over the country. Departments of linguistics have either been thrown in with modern languages and cultures, or they've just been abandoned. Major universities like Michigan have dissolved their departments. Columbia here in New York is a good example. Once upon a time, the best department of linguistics in the country, the Jacobson is still there. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing.
Well, I mean, I do think Peirce is a way forward in multiple senses.
That's
Yeah.
what I think versus Zalamea in championing, and particularly in that book, I really recommend it. The idea of continuity has not been exploited.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm sorry I caught your talk at the end, but I'll pick up from one of the points that that struck me, that I was here, obviously. Yeah, I think, I mean, being someone that also reads Zalamea in Spanish, I think I'm kind of, I mean, I would tend in a way to be a bit critical of the formulation of like the necessity for like the neo-rationalism, and I think this partially like comes from, well, the ways that the disciplines you're in and also the topics that you're addressing and the way that Zalamea theory seem to lend themselves to that. But I think in a way the whole point of like having, I mean, of like finding, for example, like maybe for like pragmatics, like a third that would be a modality of like thinking that is neither just analytical or synthetic, but in a way carrying both of those forms would be that perhaps like, you know, rationality wouldn't be in the end the name that we would give to this other thing, right? So I think it's not just the question maybe of like, and I think one concept that he takes from a Uruguayan philosopher of like rationalidad, which is you know, reason and sensibility, right? In a way, I think hints at that. In the sense that, you know, I mean, we could call it just an expanded sense of reason, but that's not what it is, right? I mean, it's not just, I think, an And I think, at least, I mean, also being someone that is reading him from literature, and specifically like Latin American literature, and yes, we are, there is the part of sensibility, I think, is also really important, because it's not just, I mean, to me, I think one of the problems is that it's not maybe just a question of like, developing new mathematical concepts to solve problems that don't yet have solutions, but even like the invention of problems.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that I think in terms of like the necessity, because it is hard in a way to not emphasize one over the other. It's quite hard to do both, right? And I think he emphasized that too. And then the other thing I actually wanted to ask, well, Fernando, if you could talk a bit about the way that, because you're talking Novalis, Valery, these are in a way, well, of literary sources that are very accessible, they're canonical in a way, even though they're works that, like the Deleuze, that are not very accessible and people haven't read, like, as like canonical works of like French literature, but nevertheless, like Novalis as a huge German poet. Whereas, Latin American authors in a way, or the work of like translating and even like, and you're doing that too in your work. So I was wondering from them if you could say a bit about what kinds of influences they have had, like in your thinking, in the way that like Novalis and Valery have had, so to speak. I mean, I know that a bit, but I would like to hear it in terms of like specific forms of conception, because I think for Novalis he did, and for Valery he did a very like broad systematization and of their concepts of broadening. And yeah, I was just wondering about that too.
Okay, I will be very short because I'm not going to speak. But Chris is going to do that. And the Latin American tradition has been extremely important for me. Very, very important. I haven't talked about that because probably I hadn't time, or I wanted to do a more or less systematic going back and forth between the beginning of modernity and modernity, and not so much working the 20th century. The 20th century, the Latin American 20th century is particularly important, in fact. And as you are saying, the good name in Spanish, as like in Spanish you have the good name between razón and corazón. The only way in which you can say that in a language congruently is in Spanish. The razonabilidad, which is the mixing together in the same way of reason and sensibility, razonabilidad, it's one term constructed by this philosopher that our guest was talking about. In general, there has been in Latin America, from Vaz Ferreira on, a very, very strong tradition of great essayists. People who have think the world from the margins, something which is extremely interesting for us as Latin Americans, because since we are not the center, we have to do the double or triple work. We have to learn what happens in Europe, to learn what happens in America, and then to produce from our borders a new understanding of that going back and forth. That I think is very interesting, because if you are in the center, usually you don't have to see the borders. But if you are in the borders, you have to see the center and go back and forth all the time. I think that is interesting, and there is a long tradition in Latin American culture which has done that in the sense of great essayists and great literary critics. Pedro Enrique Sureña, very important for me, and persons like Alfonso Reyes in Mexico, or Francisco Ortiz, Fernando Ortiz in Cuba. There have been very great essayists which have tried to understand the world in they called it systematic synthesis. They were understood themselves as synthetic philosophers or synthetic understanders of our culture in general, coming from the borders. I think that has been extremely influential for me. Yeah.
I just to speak to your question a little bit, I know we're running a little low on time here. I think some of this can be tracked back to the Romantic period, and the way in which Kant served as such a lightning bolt within the history of philosophy, whereby philosophy becomes bisected between those who have, I think, a very constricted view of what reason is, right? There's reason and it's others, right? In the first critique, he aims to put limits on what reason can do. By the third critique, he's not quite so sure, and he's looking for ways out of this. But the other side of German idealism, which really, I think, finds its simplest formulation in Hölderlin, right, who was the roommate of Schelling and Hegel at one point. Hölderlin says, look, you've either got subject and object, and then the two shall never meet, or you have one fundamental stuff from which subject and object are both polarities and emerge. And I believe that to some extent, if you divide the world in two, you have the problem that Kant and all of his inheritors have, which is how do you sew it back together? Whereas if you believe that everything comes from one fundamental stuff, then the question is, how do you deal with its diversity? And I believe that the Hegelian tradition, the Schellingian tradition, Peirce comes from this, even if indirectly. And I think Zalamea is in this tradition that is ultimately for a thick type of monism, right? Which views the world as one fundamental stuff, which has the ability to give rise to massive diversity. And that to understand this, you need a non-restricted sense of what reason is. Because otherwise you end up with the Wittgensteinian problematic from the first critique, not the first critique, from the Tractatus, right? Where he says, you know, there's what we can talk about, and we have to be silent about the rest. And of course, the irony is that he's talking about it. Yeah, right? But this is where he then goes to the philosophical investigations, because he flip-flops. He's like, no, the other approach is needed to make sense of some of these things. And I believe that Zalamea is on this approach as opposed to the more analytic approach, which draws its inspiration from Kant, which views the limits of reason very narrowly. And this is why, you know, we could say that it's a sur-reason, although that has certain baggage, right? Corazon, I think, is a great way of thinking of it, right? A reason that is not merely the sort of Kantian reductionism of what reason has been taken to mean. That would be where I'd go with this, but I'm sure Fernando would do a much better job, so. Yeah, okay. I guess we should end because we have more things coming, so thank you so much, everyone.